Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you're having a really great day. And I want to tell you a true story today, and it involves a man that was present during the Battle of Fort Fisher. So, this story is about an incident that occurred during the Civil War, and this is a true story, and it's pretty neat. It's pretty cool. I don't think a lot of people, if you are a Civil War buff, you may be familiar with this story. If you know a lot about Fort Fisher, I'm sure you've heard of it. But for those of you who haven't, I hope you'll enjoy. And even if you are familiar with the story, even if you do know it, I hope I can do the story justice and tell it the way you would like to hear it. Now, let's get right into it. This story is about a man named Christopher Columbus Bland. That was his name, Christopher Columbus Bland. He went by the name Kit, K-I-T. So he was called Kit. That was his preferred name. So I'll refer to him in the story as Kit. And Christopher Columbus Kit Bland, was born July 17th, 1846. His father's name was Barnes Bland, and his mother's name was Catherine Elizabeth Brooks. So it was around 1864 July that he enlisted in the Confederate Army. And at the time, he was around 19 years old, and he was working on his brother's farm. His brother's name was William Augustus Bland. So Kit joins the Army, and he is a private with Company K, which is the Brunswick Artillery, of the 36th Regiment. And he ends up getting stationed at Fort Fisher. Now, for those of you, I'm going to touch a little bit about Fort Fisher. We'll touch on this a little bit. I'm not going to go into great detail about Fort Fisher. There's lots of information out there, lots of videos and books galore. There's so much that you can look up and find. And this video isn't really about Fort Fisher, but I do need to tell you some things about it. Fort Fisher is located in the county. It was very strategic and very important during the Civil War because basically it protected Wilmington, and there was other places around, other forts and things, but Fort Fisher was mainly it. And during this time, the Union had a blockade, which was these ships out in the ocean, and they were blocking the Confederates from getting supplies into the ports like Charleston and Wilmington. And they had ships called blockade runners, which would mean that they would get through this Union blockade and into the ports where they would do trade and keep the Confederate Army going, Robert E. Lee's army supplied. So Fort Fisher was very important and strategic. And when Fort Fisher fell, that was going to be the end. That was the end of the South's ability to fight. So it was very important. And there were actually 2 attacks on Fort Fisher. Some people don't know that. There was 2 attacks. The first attack was it was very poorly executed. It was not done very well. It was a complete failure, honestly. And what they had the idea of doing, the Union Army, what they were going to do is they took a ship. I want to say it was called Louisiana. Forgive me if I get any dates or anything wrong with this. I'm sure there's plenty of Civil War buffs out there that can fact check all this. But what I remember reading, I believe it was called the Louisiana, and they were going to load it down. They loaded it down with ammo and gunpowder, and they had the idea they were going to bring it in close to shore, and they were going to blow it up, and it was going to be this massive explosion, and it was going to cause all this damage to the fort, and then the troops could run ashore, and they were going to win, and it was going to be an easy win or what have you. It didn't go well at all. The ship was nowhere near the shore. It was like a mile out. When it blew up, it blew up, I think, too early. It didn't do anything. It didn't do any damage. So then they bombarded the fort for like 2 days with gunfire. And the second attack happened in January, and that was a success. That was a much better executed plan, and that's actually when Fort Fisher fell. And it was within a month after Fort Fisher fell that the Union troops were marching into Wilmington and generally knew that it was all over. Okay, so let's backtrack a little bit. So they had tried to blow this thing up, and then they're bombarding the fort with just hitting it constantly with cannon. And so during that time, this is around Christmas Eve of 1864. Kit Bland is there. He's a soldier there. He's a private. And Colonel Lamb was the commander of Fort Fisher. And Colonel William Lamb, he was watching how the Union gunners were hitting the fort. And Fort Fisher is earthen. It's like dirt and mounds, and you can't see really from the ocean. I guess you couldn't see into it. So he noticed that they're firing and they're going towards where the flags are, the flagpoles. So he's like, I know what I'll do. So he has all these flags put at the west end, and so that's exactly what they done. They started firing towards the west, and what ended up happening was all this gunpowder, like he wrote later that a third of the gunpowder went over the fort and into the marsh and into the Cape Fear. So they weren't hitting the fort at all. They were just aiming for that. Now, however, he did want a flag raised on a mound battery. It's called the Mound Battery. And he wanted a flag put up there. So he sends that. He says, hey, get me a flag down there. So Captain Daniel Munn, who was there, he asked for a volunteer. And this is where Kit Bland comes in. So he's young. He's a young guy. And as most young males feel, they're invincible. They're going to live forever. So he's like, I'll do it. Give it to me. I'll do it. So he takes the flag and he starts shimmying up the pole. Now you got to understand, all this gunfire is coming towards the fort. And when they see him from afar, when the Union sees him climbing up this flagpole, they start aiming at him. They start firing towards him. And he's going up there. He's trying to tie it off. And the people under him are yelling, look out, watch out, be careful, And it's going by his head. He can feel it brushing his hair. It's just flying by. So he's hanging this flag in the middle of this battle, and he starts to come down, and he realizes that it's not floating right. It's half hanging. It's about to fall. It's all his work. It's no good because it's going to fall right back down. So he goes back up a second time and reattaches it. I have read with his handkerchief, his necktie, he puts it back up again and then climbs back down. And when his feet hit the ground, the morale of the soldiers, they just started cheering and hollering. And I guess, you think, well, hey, if he's brave enough, this young man, if he's brave enough to do something like that, then I guess we can keep fighting, can't we? And I have seen even that the Union soldiers who saw him do this thought, wow, that's pretty brave. They were impressed as well. And we know all this happened because Colonel Lamb wrote it down. He wrote it down, and he dispatched it from headquarters at Confederate Point, Fort Fisher, and he sent it off to the Governor Vance, and he dated the letter, and he commends Private Christopher Bland for having climbed the flagpole twice under heavy fire to raise the Confederate flag during a Northern naval assault on Fort Fisher on December the 24th, 1864. And at that time, the Confederate forces turned back the Christmas Eve attack on Fort Fisher. So they were able to turn back that first attack. So now, what happened to Christopher Columbus, Kit Bland? What happened to Kit after the war? Well, actually, let's get back to what happened to him after this battle. So, as I said, the second battle, the second attack, that's where Fort Fisher fell. And during that second attack, a lot of soldiers were hurt, both sides, a lot. And he was one that was hurt. He got hit, he received a wound with bombardment fragments, and it lacerated and broke his ankle. So he got evacuated and sent to the Confederate hospital, which at the time was located in Smithville, North Carolina, Smithville, and that actually is Southport, called today. It used to be called Smithville. So he is in Smithville, and he's captured by Federal forces on January 18th. 1865. And he's got all this pain. Nothing's been done with his leg. Okay, he's got a broken ankle. He can't walk. And so they send him, they send Private Bland to a prisoner of war camp in Point Lookout, Maryland. So he gets there, it's documented, he gets there February 4th, 1865. Now, he has to go another week. It was January when all this started happening, when he broke his ankle, when in the battle. Now it's January the 4th. It's February the 4th, and then it became February the 11th before he finally was sent to the Hammond General Hospital for treatment. So the physicians at this point, they see his leg and they're like, there's no saving this. So Kit became, as many Confederate war veterans, an amputee. They had to remove the lower third portion of his leg. So they take his leg and they give him a crutch and they send him back to the prisoner of war camp. They send him back. And he remains there until he takes the oath of allegiance in June of that year. So he comes back, and fast forward, he ends up getting married. He marries a lady named Elizabeth C. Boyd, and they have 13 children. He becomes a successful farmer, and he does pretty good. And eventually, life leads him to become a traveling minister preacher, and he becomes known as the peg leg preacher. And he knows what he done at Fort Fisher, and many people are aware of it, but he's kind of humble about it. He doesn't exploit it. He doesn't tell a lot. But he does, let people know, and he tells the story if they ask. But he says he lived by the Proverbs 27:2 verse, let another praise you and not your own mouth. So eventually the pain in his later years got to be too much, and Kit couldn't stand it any longer. And it's recorded in newspapers that on October 17th, 1917, that the hero of Fort Fisher took his own life. That's a sad end, but there is something else to add to that story. In January in 1995, there was a presentation ceremony, and it was held at the historic site of Fort Fisher. And an award was given posthumously, the Confederate Medal of Honor, to Private Christopher Columbus Bland for his intrepid courage in the face of the enemy and service above and beyond the call of duty. And if you go to Fort Fisher, I have seen it myself, if you go, the plaque with the medal is on the wall, and you can see that and view that citation. And I think that's really nice that they did recognize what he done and honored it. So that's the story of Kit Bland. It's a true story. And sometimes we don't get these stories. We just hear about the broader picture. We don't get to hear about the personal experiences of soldiers. They lived, they were just like us, and they were faced with decisions, life and death, at very young ages. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. Please like it, subscribe, and share it if you would like. And I appreciate you, and keep seeking. Thank you.